So before we close the book on microevolution, there are a few spots that I missed, and these are important. So I'd better tidy them up. And this is actually a good thing because it gives us an opportunity to revisit and reemphasize some of the points that we've already discussed. First, we need to talk about sexual recombination as an important source of heritable phenotypic variation in a population. Now, if I ask you, why is heritable phenotypic variation important? You should, at this point, totally have an answer ready. No phenotypic variation and the population cannot evolve. But what does sexual reproduction have to do with this? How is sex related to the existence of heritable phenotypic variation in the population? Well, as it turns out, a lot. In sexual reproduction, each parent contributes one haploid genome, a complete set of genes that's randomly assembled from maternal and paternal genes. I'm talking about the way that in meiosis, which is the cell division leading to the production of gametes, independent assortment and crossing over occur, giving rise to a huge diversity of gene combinations. In a typical sexual species, the gametes are like snowflakes. No two will have exactly the same combination of alleles. Now, with each parent contributing what is essentially a unique combination of genes, the diploid genome that results from fertilization is also a unique, never seen before combination of genes. Every generation, a brand new set of these unique, never before seen gene combinations is born. This is basically how Mendelian genetics allows the long-term maintenance of heritable phenotypic variation in ways that you would just never see with blending inheritance. Here's another key concept: polygenic inheritance. At some level, you must realize that most phenotypic traits are not controlled by a single genetic locus, like flower color in Mendel's pea plants. For a normally distributed quantitative character like body size, there may be dozens or even hundreds of genetic loci that contribute to body size. As an example, visualize 26 different loci, one for each letter of the alphabet, each of which has a small effect on body size. Each locus has two alleles, big A and little a, big B and little b, big C and little c, etc. And the capital letter will denote the allele that makes body size just a little bit bigger. And so by necessity, the lowercase letter allele, little a, little b, little c, etc., will be making body size just a little bit smaller. Now, there are going to be more than these 26 alleles that affect body size. These are just the ones for which we have allelic variation. So there are 26 alleles, the uppercase letters, that make bodies bigger, and 26 alleles with lowercase letters that make bodies smaller. You could be homozygous for all 26 lowercase genes. In other words, little a, little a, little b, little c, all the way to little z. That would be 0 capital letters, and you would have a very small body, the minimum size possible under the available genetic variation. You could also be homozygous for all 26 capital letters, and that would be 52 genes for larger body size, and this would make you maximally huge. So far, so good? Now think about the range for how many capital letters the individuals are actually going to carry in a large-ish population, say n equal to 100,000. Do you really expect to see the genotypes for the maximal and minimal body size? These are both extremely rare combinations. There's only one combination out of the bazillions that are possible that has 0 capital letters. There are 26 combinations that have one capital letter. Big A, little a, and all the rest homozygous for lowercase. Little a, big B, and all the rest homozygous for lowercase, etc., all the way to big C, little z, and all the rest homozygous for lowercase. That's 26 possible combinations. For 2 capital letters, the number of possible combinations is vastly greater, and the chances of ending up with X number of capital letters continues to increase until it hits a peak somewhere between the two ends, and then it decreases until you get to the opposite end. There's only one combination out of the bazillions with 52 capital letters. See that? Now, in the actual population, the range of genotypes realized will be much smaller, maybe ranging from here to here. 35% uppercase letters for the animal with the smallest body to 75% uppercase letters for the animal with the largest body size. Individuals in either extreme would be very rare, and the vast majority of genotypes will have an intermediate number of uppercase letters, averaging around 55%. So in this population ranging in size from this big to this big, we have genetic variation that would allow for body sizes much smaller and much larger than what we actually have. Neither of these possible extremes is actually realized because in order to get the genotypes required for them, you have to line up all the large size alleles or all the small size alleles, and this is extremely improbable. The range of body size that we actually see turns out to be a poor indicator of the amount of evolutionary potential that exists in the population based on the genes that are actually there. Let's make this example real. We know that all breeds of domestic dog have been artificially selected from an ancestral population of wolves. Presumably, the wolves that were the ancestors of domestic dogs are not much different than the wolves that we see in the wild today. Like all natural populations, modern wolves have variation in size, and some of this variation is caused by genetics. But now that we've had the preceding discussion, isn't it plausible that even with modern wild wolves, you have the genetic variation that could allow for much larger animals than the largest actual wolf, and much smaller animals than the smallest wolf? Couldn't we make a mini wolf much smaller than the smallest existing wolf by lining up all the lowercase alleles that are currently segregating in the wild wolf species? With the buildup that I gave you, of course you say yes. I used wolves here specifically because most of you are aware that our doggy friends were domesticated from wild wolf ancestors and have ended up ranging in size from Chihuahuas to French Mastiffs, that is much smaller and much larger than any existing wolf. Presumably, Chihuahuas are small because they have a high percentage of small body allelic versions of those genetic loci affecting body size. Where did all these genes for extreme size come from? There are two possibilities. One, they might have arisen by new mutation. In other words, they weren't there in the original wolf species, but rather they happened after domestication began and were selectively kept in the lineage of dogs leading to the Chihuahuas. Two, they were there to begin with. It was possible, it still is possible, to isolate a wolf genome that lines up all of the naturally occurring small body alleles and produce a smaller wolf than any existing in nature. I'm not going to commit here, but I will point out that these two are not in competition, and it's perfectly reasonable that some of these small size genes seen in Chihuahuas arose by mutation and others were already there segregating in the ancestral wolf population, part of that very large array of allelic variations accumulated over a long history of mutation in the lineage of animals leading to the wolf. Now, if wolves had been subject to a population bottleneck and had greatly reduced allelic variation, the human domesticators might not have been so successful in manipulating body size in their breeding designs. Cheetahs, for example, underwent a severe bottleneck around 11,000 years ago, and even after this much time, they still have practically no genetic variation as a species. And so, if someone were to bring cheetahs into domestication and selectively breed for small size, because mini cheetahs would be just awesome, well, it might not be a terribly auspicious enterprise. Without a standing amount of allelic variation in the source population, this breeder would be entirely dependent on new mutations occurring naturally, or, more likely in today's world, brought in deliberately with some CRISPR-Cas9 genetic tinkering. Now, the reason why populations like wolves can have such great genetic variation is sexual recombination, that random mixing and matching and creation of new genomes each generation. And hence, we consider this to be an important contributor to heritable phenotypic variation, even though it does not provide any new alleles in the way that mutation does. With sex, the population remains genetically dynamic and highly variable. And when sexual reproduction is lost, like when a species evolves asexual reproduction, the result is genotypic uniformity because all of the offspring are genetically identical with each other and to their parent. When this occurs in plants, we call it apomixis. An apomictic plant like a dandelion produces seeds without meiosis. Those seeds in the puffball you played with as a kid, they were genotypically identical to the plant that produced them. In animals, it's the same phenomenon, but we call it parthenogenesis. Partheno means virgin in Greek, while genesis is birth. Both apomixis and parthenogenesis are relatively common in nature. These are animals and plants that had been normal, sexually reproducing, and highly variable, and then they gave up sexual reproduction in favor of an all-female race. Unable to make babies, males have no way of reproducing. And females, they would have no need for males, who are kind of a waste of valuable resources anyways. Why bother? If my population reproduces sexually, and this means that half of my population is male, well, a competing population is made up of all females that reproduce clonally, who's going to win? Keep in mind that the asexual population can use all of their resources to produce babies, while my population, half goes to supporting males. The other population grows twice as fast as my population can. So, who's going to win? Yeah, this is the basic reason why species find short-term success by giving up sexual reproduction in favor of parthenogenesis. In the case of plants, a plant that can produce seed apomictically also saves big. It doesn't need to produce pollen, and it doesn't need to attract pollinators with showy, sweet-scented, nectar-filled, and very expensive flowers. All of those resources can go into seed production. Now, with all of these advantages for asexual reproduction, why are there any species that remain sexual? The answer is ability to evolve. Evolvability, if you like. An asexual species might actually be very well suited to current conditions, the habitat in its current state. But in the event of environmental change, a warming climate, the introduction of new pathogen are a couple that should sound familiar to us. A genetically uniform population can be wiped out, while a genetically variable population will at least have some potential to evolve and adapt to the new conditions. Yes, it may be highly advantageous to evolve asexual reproduction on the short term, but over a larger window of time, doing so might be ensuring your extinction. Lineages that keep sexual reproduction have short-term disadvantages relative to asexual species, but in the long run, they are the ones that persist. Sexual reproduction, as we now know, goes hand in hand with genetic recombination, which results in the maintenance of high levels of heritable phenotypic variation. It also creates an opportunity for a special form of natural selection, specifically when it comes to animals. Fitness is at the core of natural selection, and we've been thinking about this as the expected success in survival and reproduction, a good general formulation. Now, there's a small part of reproductive success that hinges on the animal's ability to successfully attract a mate. Under certain conditions, the result is sexual dimorphism, in which males have an extreme phenotype that may be difficult to reconcile with the animal's ability to survive. The peacock's enormous, gaudy tail is a classic example. These bizarre and beautiful tail feathers are limited to the male pea-birds. The peahens, the females, are drab, brown-gray. And there's no possible way that these showy tail feathers, which are also heavy and bulky, are good for the peacock's survival fitness. They make the bird more obvious to predators and also slower to take flight. The first and obvious question is, why have the males evolved to have these extreme phenotypes if they're bad for survival? And this is also the easiest to answer. You could have probably answered this before you read the chapters in the text. You did read the chapters in the text, right? Males compete with other males to attract those drab, gray-brown peahens as mating partners. And the peahens are the ones that determine which males have offspring and which don't. Males with less showy tail feathers don't succeed, and those with feathers making the grandest display that is most appealing to the females will succeed in passing their genes for those showy tail feathers onto their offspring. Now, even if the less showy males were more successful in escaping predation, what's the good of surviving if you can't attract a mate? I say this in the coldest sense that actually doesn't apply as entirely to humans, because there are plenty of ways besides offspring for a human to have their identity persist into the future beyond just the physical genes in their genome. Think of the impacts that some people have had throughout history with their successful memes rather than their genes. Meme is actually a very old word that had been brought back into the public consciousness by Richard Dawkins decades before the advent of internet angry kittens and the like. The idea that one's memes could be part of the calculus in determining a person's fitness is itself a meme. If you want to learn more about this, you should do a search with the keywords Dawkins and memes. Or, better yet, read one of his books. Getting back to sexual selection now. There are two distinct modes of sexual selection, and these depend on who or what determines male mating success. In the case of peacocks, the control over mating success belongs to the peahens. The females choose which males are sexy and which are not. This mode is called intersexual selection in the textbook. I like the more descriptive term female choice, accounting for the way that in nearly every case, it's the females that are making the decision about which males succeed, and only very rarely it goes the other way, with males picking the successful females. Yes, there are the phalaropes, kind of duck, in which females are subject to sexual selection by way of male choice. But this, and a few other exceptions, maybe humans, are exceptional. Females are choosing, and males are the ones with the extreme phenotypes nearly every time. The other mode of sexual selection is identified in the textbook as intrasexual competition, though I prefer the more conventional term of male-male combat. Again, it's almost always the males that are competing, and here the actual competition is a physical fight. With male-male combat, the females are not the ones in control. They congregate in harems that are won by the victorious male. Examples of this are bighorn sheep, where the rams smash heads until the one left standing gets to smash with the ewes of the harem. Or the elephant seals we talked about in the last lecture. Males engage in a violent sumo match with a lot of biting involved. And the one who isn't chased from the beach has mating rights to all of those female seals that are basking on the sand. With male-male combat, that is, intrasexual competition, the special characteristic limited to males is almost always exaggerated body size and or some kind of weaponry. The horns on the ram are an example of this. Male elephant seals weigh up to 10 times as much as females. One might wonder if this added size could be good for survival as well. Is it really a disadvantage? Then again, if we're really that good for survival, why aren't the females just as large? It's more likely that females, under no such selection for extreme anything, are closer to conforming to what's best for survival. And if this is true, then the main advantage of the male elephant seal's supersized bodies is the edge that it gives them in winning the battles over the ladies. I should add here that the daughters of the successful males will also be carrying the genes for large body size and weaponry, and it may not be possible to isolate the development of oversized bodies or any other special phenotype to the males alone. For example, female sheep also have horns, though not as large as the male's horns. Now, it could be that these horns are adaptive as defensive weapons against predators, but it might also be that you can't have horns on only one sex. If you want big horns on the rams, you also have to have horns on the ewes. This is the same kind of developmental constraint that explains the nipples on male mammals, though in that case, it's not related to sexual selection. Females need nipples for reasons other than winning a mate. You should note that in contrast to male-male combat, where the males are all about size, strength, and weapons, with female choice-driven sexual selection, there's no predictability about what kind of male characteristic becomes the thing that's going to be the criterion for judging. Birds have feathers, of course, and we know how feathers can be made flashy with pigments. So brightly colored plumage is often the first thing we think of when it comes to a trait that's subject to female choice-driven sexual selection in birds. But even in birds, feathers are often just part of a larger courtship display used by males to convince females to mate with him. There are also eyes, beak, and feet that can be made to have flashy colors. Singing and dancing are often part of the show, and in some species, males congregate with other males and do their courtship ritual to a large audience of females, kind of like an expo, only in this case, it's called a lek. This is the Swedish word meaning match or game. If you've ever been to a trade show, you know the scene. The vendor with the loudest, most catchy spiel ends up with a big crowd, and if you happen to be in that crowd, you often walk away with a bit of swag. In the case of females attending a lek, that swag would be the favorite male's sperm. The crazy thing to think about here is how arbitrary the selected traits are. Maybe in one species, the females like yellow feathers and a loud, low-pitched vocalization, while in a closely related species, the females want blue rump feathers and a red head crest. If it seems completely weird to you, you're not alone. If someone brings it up, we can spend some time on this point when we have our live meeting. The second question to ponder here is, why is it the male sex that's almost always the one to evolve the extreme phenotypes? I really like this discussion because it requires us to think about something we haven't dealt with much so far, the strength of selection. Natural selection can be weak or it can be strong or it can be anywhere in between. An example of weak selection on beak size would be if long-billed birds had a 25% advantage in fitness relative to short-billed birds. In contrast, it would be strong selection if only the top 25% of birds with the longest bills survive and parent the next generation. Now, which of these two will result in faster evolutionary change? Bigger steps with each generation, causing more change over less time. Okay, now let's say that both males and females are competing. Males compete with males, females compete with females to be sexy and to attract the greatest number of mates possible. How are the sexes different in the upper limit to mating success? Well, males have a far higher cap. They can be incredibly successful, and this is entirely because sperm are very cheap to produce. A single male produces more sperm with one ejaculate than there are individuals in the entire species. One single male could hypothetically be the father of the entire next generation. This would require extreme polygyny, of course, as well as some way for that male to get around, to inseminate all the females, each probably getting a very small number of sperm. This isn't realistic, but you should be able to envision intense competition of males such that only 25% of the males will be responsible for 100% of all the offspring produced in the next generation. By the way, I used the term polygyny rather than polygamy. Polygyny means many females for one male. The opposite, many males for one female, would be polyandry. Polygamy, is the more gender-neutral term. Many mates for one individual, sex unspecified. And so you could say that females can also play that game. They can be polyandrous. Why is it so rare for competition among females to be as intense as it is for males? Well, eggs are costly to produce, and so a female's lifetime output of eggs won't be close to male's lifetime output of sperm. Bird eggs in particular are really large, and in both mammals and birds, the babies require maternal care, and this further limits the maximum reproductive output for females. There could still be variation, And perhaps the most successful females produce 25% more offspring compared with the least successful females. But there's nothing stopping those least successful females from having babies. With sperm cheap and no shortage of horny males, there aren't going to be a lot of unmated females. And this is in total contrast to the way that when males compete intensely, the great majority of males go unmated and have zero reproductive success. So even though both sexes might be under selection for successful attraction of mates, one sex evolves to greater extremes. Which one? You got it. That's why males are almost always the ones to have the ridiculous phenotypes. Related to this question is, why are monogamous species typically sexually monomorphic, that is, not having extreme phenotypes in males? In monogamy, males and females form more or less permanent mating pairs, and this is often associated with ecologies in which parental care from both mother and father is required for the successful raising of the babies. Because of monogamous pairing, there isn't much difference between the most successful and the least successful individuals of either sex. With little variation in mating success, the selection on phenotypes related to attractiveness to mates is weak. Both sexes are likely going to conform with a phenotype that's very good for survival. Think about Canadian geese, or the famously monogamous swans. You don't see any obvious physical dimorphisms in these monogamous species. The last and most challenging question relating to sexual selection pertains specifically to female choice. Why do females evolve extreme preferences? Presumably, the ancestral state of the peacock's tail did not include anything that was capable of splaying out 2 meters of iridescent green with dark blue eyes. It may have been somewhat showy, but not nearly as showy as modern peacock tails. And so the females of that time could not have been able to have a preference for 2-meter tails because no such tails existed. It may have been that males at that time ranged from drab to slightly showy. And so the ladies went with the slightly showy ones, who did extremely well fitness-wise, and the sons of these matings then had more showy tail feathers than the previous generation of males. The females of that newer generation, again, selected the most showy of the males, and incrementally over time, the males became more and more showy, more and more extreme in their phenotypes. Okay, you got that part. It's relatively easy to see why males evolved their phenotypes. It's because the females consistently made sure that only the gaudiest males with the most ridiculous plumage would be the fathers of the next generation of birds. But why were the females so persistent with their demands for more and more and more showiness? If you think about it, the female preference had to be growing along with the tail feathers in the males. There could never be a point where the females said, okay, that's enough, any more would be overkill. No matter how showy the males got, the females would continually prefer the most showy of the males. Do you see the problem here? A 1-meter wide tail feather display would be plenty showy. When the average male tail size was able to make a 1-meter spread, the females might have said, oh yes, 1 meter is perfect. After which, the male tail feathers would not be selected to evolve any greater length. But instead of being pleased with males as they were, the females just raised the bar. 1 meter is pretty good, but that bird over there, 1.1 meters. Very impressive. I think I'll follow him around. What would females be losing out on if they just went with an average male, or one with a modest tail? That might be actually the best, since the extreme tail feathers must be a liability when it comes to survival fitness. This is a good spot to break.